to maybe watch this after the fact. So, well, again, thanks for joining. Looks like a small crowd, so I'm going to hand it over to Ned here in a second, but looks like we could maybe be a little informal, however Ned wants to do it. But thanks to Ned and John both for joining us. We're going to hear from them about basically the flood mapping updates and the related bylaw updates, and I will leave it at that. Thanks again, Ned. It's all yours, or John, I guess, whoever wants to speak.
Well, actually, how about if I'll take over, but I'd love to hear who's in the room. I don't know everybody here. We're a small group, so I'd just love, maybe Jason, if you could just introduce yourself. Everybody knows you, of course, and then we'll just kind of go around, and I'd love to know what town you're in and what kind of role you play would be really helpful to me.
Sounds good. I should have thought of that. Jason Rasmussen, Mount Scottney Regional Commission. Why don't I just call you out so it's not chaos? John, do you mind going next?
Nope, that's fine. So John Brooker Campbell, I work with Ned within the Rivers program, and I am the regional floodplain manager covering this region.
And Holly, do you go next?
All right, so my name is Halima. You can call me Hallie. I'm working as a regional planner for the 3 towns, Windsor, Rockingham, and Wethersfield. I've joined recently, only less than 2 months ago.
Thank you.
That's all for now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Mark, you're up next.
Hi, I'm Mark Corbin. I'm a newly elected member of Reading's Planning Commission.
Thanks for joining us. Win. You mind going, Win?
Win Johnson. I live in West Windsor, and I make Deb Shearer's job miserable. Zoning administrator.
Chuck, you're up next. We're not hearing you, Chuck. Well, Chuck's from Springfield. I'll leave it at that. Maybe we'll try again. Deb, you're next.
Deb Shearer, I'm the zoning administrator for West Windsor, and I'm just going to say I'm going to turn off my video so I can eat. There you go.
Okay,
that's good. Yeah.
Let's see, Carrie, you're next.
Sure. Carrie Kello from Springfield. I am technically officially the town hall assistant in Springfield, but I'm the planning and zoning assistant and the town clerk assistant and the select board secretary.
And street sweeper. Thanks for joining us. Martha, I think you are the last one.
Hi, I'm Martha. I'm a planner with the Mount Scottney Regional Commission.
Great. Thank you all so much for just introducing yourselves so I just know who's here. And what I like to do is share this set of slides, just to kind of introduce the topic and walk through it together. As we go along, it's a small group. And so please feel free to just unmute and say, hey, well, Ned, what was that? Talk about that again, or just clarify things as we go along. I don't mind being interrupted or, and asked to clarify something that was obscure. And then there's going to be bigger questions about policy and what goes on in my town and your town and that sort of thing. And let's hold those to the end, and then we can get into that a little bit together and talk about those things. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And let's see if it turns up. Everybody see water? Okay, Jason says yes. Excellent. So I'm going to go ahead and hide my video. Stop video. Okay. So thank you very much for being here today. And let's see now. It's not cooperating. Oh, come on. There we go. So 1938, a little bit before the time of most of us here, but you may remember the Long Island Express came up the valley and named a number of landmarks, including Hurricane Hill up in White River Junction, and a lot of damage all through New England and affecting our entire region. Of course, we've had other floods since that as well. This most recent flood, by the way, this is a map in the Washington Post. You can see some of the distribution of this. So a fair amount of it just down in Westchester County, New York, and then kind of skipping up to the Berkshires and slamming into Vermont. So big piles of rain ending up in southern Vermont and then central and even up into northern Vermont. So humid air mass coming off of superheated ocean water in Florida, coming up the coast and hitting the mountains where, as you know, from the eye on the sky, adiabatic cooling drops the water on us. So we have a history of different kinds of exposure to flooding. The maps here are actually a little quick comparison of what just happened on the left in July of this year and August in 2011. So a number of us were around for that and helped to mop up. On the right, August 2011, the red and then the lavender purple show you where the heaviest rainfalls were, a lot of it in extreme southern Vermont and southern central Vermont. And Ludlow was one of the communities hit hard at that time. On the left, the July event, the distribution really followed the mountains. And so again, different chloropeth, but the highest levels of rainfall again are in the darkest purple here. So really showing up across the Green Mountains. So we're going to talk about the FEMA flood maps that are being updated right now and talk a little bit about bylaws and community relationship with the maps for the Mount Scottney region. And I just want to say that this is something that we're doing together. You know, all of you as planners, as members of planning commissions and select boards, we need to be talking to each other. I notice I don't hear of a lot of select board people here tonight, but we do need to be talking together and talking with our communities about flood hazards and how we prepare for them, because we get the disaster that we plan for. And flooding is common, flooding is natural, and flooding does not have to be a disaster. And it's only if we're picking for that option. But to help us as community officials and communities, we have staff from Mount Scottney Regional Commission, Jason Rasmussen with us this evening, and Chris Urich. John Broker Campbell, you just met a little while ago, who is the Regional Floodplain Manager. Ned Swanberg, am working with the statewide process around the FEMA maps, working with regional planners and communities in the update process to keep people aware of them and hopefully updating bylaws in the nick of time or earlier. So we'll talk about the map update process, the bylaw update process, and model bylaws for no adverse impact on each other and on the floodplains that actually serve our communities when they can exist. So this is a quick look at the Mount Scottney region, and in this we can see a number of our communities represented this evening, and in red you can see the currently mapped special flood hazard areas in the region, and the dots are buildings, insurable buildings all through that. So obviously lots more buildings that are not at high risk, but these are the ones that are in the high risk zone as mapped. So floodplains are not just disaster zones, or shouldn't be disaster zones at all. They actually are doing many things that are helpful to us, natural and beneficial functions. So they're basically places that store floodwater and move floodwater through our communities in identifiable places. They also are moving ice and debris, sometimes shed and propane tanks, things you might want to stay out of the way of. They're also keeping the water clean because they are providing a space that traps sediments, notably the disgusting silt that drops out, and keeps it from flushing into Long Island Sound and down into Lake Champlain and other places downstream. So capturing those nutrients that otherwise are causing pollution all the way down the system. They're enriching the soil. They're often places where the water supply gets recharged. They're providing space for agriculture and forestry in a lot of communities. They're also places of particular importance for wildlife. And they're places in Vermont of particular exceptional recreational value and beauty and inspiration, swimming in the Rock River and so forth, and all these features that are important to us. Finally, I want to remember that and remind us that there are also places that help us by reducing flood levels. the height of the flood water by spreading it out over more places and more area. And they're also reducing flood power. And in Vermont, flood power is the greatest source of damage to us as communities. So in Vermont, we've gone through a process of creating officially digital flood insurance rate maps. And that really started in Windham County and Windsor counties back in 2007. So, and then since then, it's gone on to Rutland, Chittenden, Washington, Bennington counties was the most recent county, a small handful of towns preceding that. So for Windsor County, those maps are now 16 years old. But in fact, they are even older than that. And if you go back and you look at the maps in our communities that were digitized, some of those are 45 years old or more. When the maps were most recently updated for the DFIRM, there were very few fresh new studies done. And in fact, in Windsor, the only one they did was along the Connecticut River. So all the rest of the data in the Mount Ascutney region was basically taking these old town maps and lining them up by road intersections and bringing them into the computer the way they are, and really pretty rough stuff, and of pretty ancient vintage. So this is what we have when we talk about a digital flood insurance rate map. And the flood insurance rate map is the map that the community manages and is required to administer if the community wants to be in the National Flood Insurance Program. And so the digital map is a big step forward for sure. One, it has aerial photos behind it. And so on the aerial photo, you can see features like the channel of the river. It's actually visible now, and buildings are visible. You can also see special flood hazard areas, the areas that the community takes responsibility for, at least that much, which includes Zone AE up in the upper right corner and Zone A in the lower left. So Zone AEs have E elevations attached to them, base flood elevations to describe how high the water comes, and Zone A's don't. Zone A's are just approximate areas that where it looks like or it seems that there are areas subject to flooding, but they weren't studied by detailed methods, and there's no official base flood elevations along them. You can also see a hatch marked area, which is the floodway of the river. So this is an area with special protections to provide a right of way for the water during the flood stage. And finally, on the maps, you can see cross sections. In this case, the cross section P is labeled as having a flood elevation of 542.7 feet, NAVD 88. And so as it flows, in this case, north, up to the top of the screen, you can see that it's going downhill to 542.1. And in between, you can figure out how high the water is at each building through a process of working with the map and the study. Off to the right, in the lower right, you can see this gray area, which is the extent of the next larger flood that was mapped based on the available topography, contours, and the study from the movement of that water volume down the valley. So this is the 0.2% annual chance flood, or the 500-year flood. So the special flood hazard area is sometimes called the 100-year flood, but we don't use that on a day-to-day basis because it's confusing. Everybody thinks that once you say something is a 100-year flood, they have another 99 years or more in which they will not get flooded, and that's not the case. Each year, there's a 1% chance of getting that size flood, and then lots of smaller floods too. Anyway, so that size flood or larger with a 1% chance every year, and if you win, then that ticket goes back in the hat and gets mixed up with the other 99 tickets. They get scrambled, and another selection is made the next year. Each year, you get to reach in there and see if you find the same ticket, and you can, multiple years. This is a schematic from FEMA showing the map process and how it goes down in terms of the studies and the legal process from left to right. So on the upper right corner now, we're looking at we're really concerned about the effective date. When does the new map become official? And so that's the critical thing that we all have our eyes on, and we can't really say. All we can do is kind of roughly estimate when that's going to be. We'll know that better. We'll know that precisely when FEMA issues a letter of final determination, and that'll tell us the effective date is in 6 months. And by the time you get that letter of final determination, it's hard to do a bylaw adoption inside of 6 months. And so the trick that we're trying to do right now is to say, before that letter shows up, let's make sure we've talked in our communities and done the background work so that we can do the right thing when the time comes or before that. So on the far left, the first thing that happened was there was a discovery meeting. FEMA basically said, this is the data we have. We're going to do a study. What is the community concerned about? Are there places we need to pay special attention to? And that all goes into a process to identify a report. And from that, FEMA says, well, we're going to prioritize doing more work, more highly detailed work in these places because the community said it was important and because there's a lot of people there and a lot of development pressure. Those are places we're going to prioritize. Other places next time. So that's
Have a good one.
Are you in tomorrow?
Yes.
So that's basically the discovery report. And now what we're waiting for is the work maps. So they're about to show up. We're expecting work maps this winter. And those will be basically working draft maps that we will have a chance to look at. And that'll be a really important step for our communities to be involved in, and for municipal officials specifically. And then after that, we're projecting that we got to get our stuff together. So we've got to have, this is basically the due date. We got to have a prep deadline. And so that's what we're trying to do, is get all of our community work done with plans, if you need to work on plans, and bylaws, if you need to work on bylaws, and have that all done before the prep deadline and before the maps go effective. And the sooner the better, and it doesn't get confused in the legal process at the FEMA end or the community end. On the left is a map of the state and the watersheds that are being studied. So in the ancient past, in the first maps from the 70s and 80s, the maps are always done town by town. And then at the edges of the town, the maps often didn't match because the studies were done over different years with different data. The most recent data that we saw for Windsor County was assembled into a county-wide DFIRM. And in this next go-round, FEMA is thinking that the studies should really be done in the context of how water moves through the landscape. So they're looking at what's called HUC-8 watersheds, large watersheds, and how the water flows from the top of the watershed and the hills and the edges down to the lowest point in the watershed, and mapping the flow and the pooling of water as it moves. So that's the approach being done in terms of hydrology and in hydraulics, how it's being modeled of moving through the landscape. And this is kind of the status of the maps in Vermont right now. The darker blue, the more well prepared. So in the very far north, Franklin and Orleans County and Lake Champlain in general have some of the most advanced process underway. And so we're really expecting those counties and watersheds to become engaged really earliest in this process. Weirdly enough, in the extreme southwestern corner of the state, well, really the Deerfield watershed in Bennington County, FEMA has already pretty much finished up. So they've actually jumped ahead a bit because there was a lot of pressure in Massachusetts to work on the Deerfield, and they've actually already published preliminary maps for those sections of fairly rural areas in the tops of the Green Mountains in southern Vermont. So those are already kind of coming to fruition. And then in between, all these other watersheds are at different stages. When all the watersheds in the county are done, then the county will become put up with a letter of final determination and go to an effective date as a county. So right now we're looking at watershed by watershed, various meetings. And then the last watershed in the county will trigger the real deadlines that we're concerned about. So in Windsor County, we're looking really at this winter to see this last of the work map meetings becoming available across the county, including the local watershed for the Black Connecticut watershed that is locally relevant. So it's coming up now. And after that, 2.5, 3 years, somewhere in there, they're going to likely pull it all together and go to a finish date. So we'll likely be looking at a prep date within 2.5, 3 years. And there's a website. I can put the post in the chat later, but it's there's a bit.ly link, bit.ly/FEMA-map-update. And if you go to that, it'll give you the most recent information that we have for the maps at the county level. So that's a place to keep track of over time. So again, last county work map meeting leading to a prep deadline. In between, you may need to update a plan, I'm not sure, and you may need to update a bylaw, I'm not sure, but these are things that need time if you're going to be doing it, and if you're going to be doing it well and thoughtfully. So again, probably 2.5 to 3 years in the county, and I want to say that that's really plenty of time to do it well if you get started. So looking at the region, a number of towns have, this is actually a report from the Flood Ready website, and again, bit.ly/flood-risk-report, and there's a whole bunch of reports there, reports for each community and also by region and county and statewide. And this summarizes some of the important data for the counties, for the communities in the region. So here we can see in column 4, it says LHMP, which is the local hazard mitigation plan. And all the towns in the region have an updated local hazard mitigation plan, but Baltimore, I think it seems to have, is missing its current hazard mitigation plan. And that's important because it's one of the basic things that help communities get help after disaster from ERAF. I'll tell you more about that later. So what else do we see? Actually, for Baltimore, I also have information which says that they have a plan right now, a municipal plan, which authorizes the community to adopt bylaws, or the local hazard mitigation plan would authorize communities to adopt bylaws related to hazards as well. The Baltimore plan seems to expire next summer. So right now they could move ahead, but after August, they may need to reinvent a plan, reauthorize a plan before they can move ahead with any bylaw changes. So just something to keep in mind with timelines. 2 communities have explicitly protected river corridors, so both Cavendish and Reading. And this is an area that is important on a statewide level as part of our flood resilience work at a state and watershed level. So it's just something to be aware of. Those 2 communities also are now getting the highest level of public support through ERAF, Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund, after federally declared disasters. So they get the maximum 17.5%, whereas communities that are missing one of the basic 4 would drop to 7.5%. Most communities are in between. So in the region, 11 communities, they all participate in the NFIP. I'm not sure how many really need a plan update, depending on when communities move to do any bylaw work. I'm not sure how many communities may choose to adopt by ballot. Right now, the law has changed in Vermont, so small communities, rural communities do not need to adopt by Australian ballot, but many might choose that. And that's important just because if you're on the Planning Commission or Select Board, you've got to be clear about when you're going to do that, so you can take advantage of town meeting date or perhaps a federal election date to have a reasonable turnout by the community to be involved. So the last work map meeting in the county, again, is going to be probably this winter for both the Black and White rivers affecting the county, and leading to likely a deadline sometime in the summer 2026. So the nature of the flood studies, we're going to get into a little bit of what that looks like right now. So the FEMA studies happening have at least three different elements. One is they're working on these zone A's, these areas that don't have official base flood elevations, but they are widespread in many communities around the state. And because they've never been studied by detailed methods, we're going to have whole new, fresh, and much more believable zone A's. They're being done by computer modeling, a process called two-dimensional base level engineering. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. The other thing that'll happen is that the mapping process will take the old studies that are in halfway good shape, and they will redelineate them. They'll draw the edges differently based on the new, higher quality topography from 1-foot contours that are now available from LiDAR statewide. And so if the edge says it's, if the elevation comes up to 931 feet, then they're going to match it to effectively the edge of 931 feet at that spot. And instead of something a little bit more one way or the other. And that is more typical of what we see currently. And finally, there will be actual updated detailed studies done with new information about bridges and roads and culverts related to three different riverine systems in the region. The Connecticut itself is going to get restudied, the Black River and part of the Williams River. So those are the areas where we expect fresh new studies with floodways and so forth. So this is the zone A situation. And on the left, you can see a zone A map from an existing DFIRM. And it's this kind of purple blobby thing that follows a stream through the landscape. And that was based on, kind of a interesting process of looking at the stream and the 20-foot contours and kind of roughing in where the flood might be. On the right is the new product that's coming out again through a computer-based modeling process in which the landscape has been divided up into little squares, each one with an elevation, each one of which pours off into another square, and the water kind of accumulates and pools in certain places and results in this map. So this map, in this case, shows in the blue hatch marked area, the zone A that's being identified by two-dimensional base level engineering, and will appear on the new maps coming in that community. The amber leveled striped area on that map on the right is actually the modeled 500-year flood. So again, a different discharge being modeled on that small stream and being precisely delineated according to 1-foot contours. So they're both kind of important to be mindful of. And one thing the community may want to do is pay attention to that in terms of how you direct development in your community. Actually, let me say one more thing about the 2D base level engineering. All of the work that's been done in the past at the town level has always been focused on riverine flooding, basically the flooding along big rivers where they've had flood gauges, and to some degree the larger tributaries that flow into them higher in the watershed. The new maps from two-dimensional base level engineering will do it both ways. There'll be the detailed studies in the valley on the big systems and the big tributaries, but in the rest of the landscape, it's actually going to be modeling the flow of water across the land itself, stream or no stream, and how it gets to the stream. So you're going to see maps with flood hazards in areas where right now there aren't any maps because there aren't any real big streams, but there might be a wetland or there might be some other depositional place in the landscape that gets really wet. This is a quick look at the state, and in yellow are the river segments that have been flagged for getting detailed studies. Those are the highest quality, most work-intensive, expensive studies in the state. This is a quick look at a draft work map that was coming together in Deerfield watershed. And in this case, on the left, this is the effective flood insurance rate map, which is similar to what you would have in your own community. And you can see the hatch marked is the floodway. The blue area here on the left is the zone AE, the flood hazard with base flood elevations delineating the edge precisely, but kind of rounded off in the mapping world. And this is the effective map at this date. On the right is the draft work map for this next firm in that area, which we haven't actually seen the final preliminary in that area. But this shows you basically the same data. It's been redelineated. So the floodway is identical. It didn't change at all. It's just shown in a different color. And then the edge of the zone AE is mapped to a higher level of detail or precision using the higher quality topo from 1 foot contours that really weren't available in the past. So it's not quite as rounded, it's much more precise on the ground and easier to work with at the administrative level in the community. Off in the upper left, you can see this bluish or grayish area, and this is actually a newly discovered zone A that wasn't on the old map. And this is, again, a product of the base level engineering coming in and informing that area. This area here with the amber color, in this case, is actually identified newly here as a 500-year flood. So it looks like the special flood has the 1% annual chance flood is a little bit narrower. The 500-year flood is kind of much in that same area on the new map, as delineated by the 1 foot contour. So that's a feature there. And then off in the upper right-hand corner, another new feature pops up. And this is actually an area that was modeled by the computer base level engineering, two-dimensional modeling as being a place for water pools and creates an area with a 1% annual chance risk. But because it's kind of an isolated area and not really connected into a stream or river, they are going to name it as a 500-year flood area and not as a base flood area, a zone A. So just a different kind of outcome in that case. But if you look at it, you would probably say, oh yeah, that's a wetland, that's a beaver swamp or something like that. On the left, we have a map of the state and the watersheds under study. And on the right, you can see the region and the 3 major riverine systems. So from the south, the Williams, then the Black and the Millbrook coming in. Those are the big systems that define the Mount Scottney region. And again, we have the existing flood hazard map for the region. In this case, I'm showing the red areas are the areas with zone AE information, base level engineering, the higher detailed studies. And the paler red areas are the zone A areas where there aren't any base level engineering or any kind of base flood information. That'll be done in the new BLE process. But the red areas are the areas that have effective elevation information. And then on this, I've overlain it with the extent of the new studies. So these will be the new places where we have new detailed studies, the highest quality product. The areas that remain bright red are going to have the old data. So that'll be the older information from past studies that might be 45 years old, but delineated to match the new 1 foot contours. So I just want to move along to talk a little bit about the bylaws. And we're going to talk particularly about the no adverse impact model bylaws that Vermont DEC has available online. I hope you will look at them and consider them. The communities in the region mostly have bylaws that were adopted, again, 16 odd years ago, and predate Tropical Storm Irene, and predate July, and predate the decades to come. And it might be a good time to shake them down and to think about it together, about what sort of disaster you want to plan for, and how you want people to be involved in that disaster or not. And so the model bylaws really kind of speak to the key things that are important that I'm trying to get across to you today, which are both river corridor protection and how to also think about the special flood hazard areas. So in the river corridors, these areas near streams and rivers where it's mapped, identified, don't build things that are any closer than what's already there. That's the basic idea. Stay back from the river in those areas. Leave room for the streams and rivers to change over time without creating new conflicts where the house is being put into an erosion hazard and is at risk of being washed away, and where in protecting that house or that new feature, it forces the water to move more quickly down the hill and affect the town roads and the people that live on the next village down the valley. So by protecting river corridors, we're protecting floodplain function and the well-being of the community by leaving room where it's available to it still for the river and the stream. Special flood hazard area, the idea of no adverse impact is not to be filling them, not to be filling areas that we can have water in when we need water to be someplace, and we don't want to push it onto our neighbors, friends, and family nearby. And the other idea in the no adverse impact bylaws is that if you have a building in the flood hazard area, to be sure that the lowest floor is safe. The lowest floor is at least 2 feet above the flood elevation to make sure that when the water comes, and it's going to come in lots and lots of smaller floods and a fewer larger floods, that there is no danger, that you can sleep through the night and you don't worry about losing your home and all that you care about and care for. So letting the floodplains work for us and also not being increasing the risk for those that are also in or near the floodplains in your community and downstream. And the models are posted online, and I'll put these they're in a handout, actually. I'll be able to put a link to that in chat later on, but they're on a web page and you can get to it through the bit.ly link /model-regulations, and you'll find model standalone bylaws and an annotated version of those and information about how they compare with other standards, a crosswalk. And then there's also another model where it's all broken out by different sections that you can look at that as well. So again, my pitch to you today is to think about both of these seriously, both the special flood hazard area, which is the area that gets wet, and the river corridor, which is the room that the river or stream needs for the channel to move over time, and protecting room for the river and floodplain functions. So the model bylaws basically carry a number of elements. Again, within the river corridor, don't build closer than what's already there. No net fill in the special flood hazard area, and the lowest floor elevation being at least 2 feet above the base flood. Those are the key elements in the model. Why not just add fill in the floodplain? So on the top, you can see a house that's built in a lovely spot near the river. And there it is, it's in flood stage, and it's really close to the house, but it's dry. And then across the river comes in somebody that wants to build a whole new shopping complex or a condo development, and they put in a big fill pad. And after the development is done, that floodwater is now redirected onto a house that previously had been dry at that same level of discharge. So the regrading and filling has affected neighbors and flooded roads and changed people that were in a safe situation, maybe marginally, into a disastrous situation. So fill is deflecting the floodwater toward and onto other land, other people, increasing floodwater heights, increasing the power and damage being done. Why 2 feet above the flood level, the base flood elevation? On the right-hand side, you can see a USGS gauge on the Mad River, and the USGS has decorated this recently with markings showing the history of high water events in the Mad River up by Waitsfield and Waterbury, Vermont. And there's actually another gauge in the Saxons River area that USGS has also decorated. I would love a photo of that, but that also shows the different elevations of floods over time. And in the upper portion of this, you can see Gretchen Alexander pointing to the top, which on the Mad River was the flood of November 1927, when a tropical storm snuck up the valley on saturated soils and created the largest disaster in New England and Vermont. And then just below that is the flood elevation from Tropical Storm Irene in August 2011. And then further down is really how high the water is modeled to come with the Q100, the special flood hazard area on the Mad River. So when the new maps come out on the Mad River, they're not going to be updated by new studies. They're going to be using the old discharge from older studies, and they're going to delineate it to that elevation, not the other two events that have happened within 100 years. Pretty weird, but you have to understand that areas that don't get fresh new studies are going to be carrying older hydrology that predates, of course, 2023, because this won't be incorporated into the maps and won't incorporate the data from 2011 and even 2090s, I'm sorry, the 1990s. So the data that's informing these things is not talking about the best information we might otherwise generate. So my points might be, why 2 feet above the floodwater? Floods come in many sizes, many small, some larger. At the edge of the special flood hazard area, there's more than a 1 in 4 chance of having a flood during a 30-year mortgage. The base flood is determined by the past, even the very far past. Redelineated areas will reflect old hydrology from before Tropical Storm Irene and more. Precipitation levels have been increasing since the 70s in known ways. We don't know what's going to be happening in the decades upcoming. The higher your lowest floor, the more likely you're not going to be damaged. And the highest, the lowest floor, the less costly it is to insure the building for that risk. And it's easier to avoid disaster than live through it. So all the reasons why going forward, we can use this kind of information to have communities that function, can pay their taxes, can get to work, can go to school, can be happy, can live together and enjoy life in Vermont. Why protect river corridors? There's a couple basic reasons. One is to avoid a known erosion hazard, so you don't have to fight the stream and river and then spend thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars trying to riprap to protect your septic system or your well or your house. So it's a little cheaper, it's a little bit more sane, it's respecting the river. And it's also not, as a community, promoting an attractive nuisance. We now have maps of river corridors statewide. And if your town says, it's fine to build in the river corridor, you will end up with people building in the river corridor. And that will actually be driving a process that hurts everybody in town. In the upper right, you can see a house placed just a tad too close to the stream, and then it gets damaged, and they put in bank armoring to protect the house because it's where they live. It's where the family survives. It's important to do. But that ends up oftentimes redirecting the energy, sometimes causing the channel to be confined and to dig deeper and deeper and stack higher and become more powerfully heavy erosive in the system. And as that happens in sizes, eventually the bank will fail and the house will fall, the road will collapse. And so by avoiding placing stuff too close to the stream or river or closer than what's already there, we can avoid a lot of this known process that's likely to happen. So the river corridor as mapped includes the meander belt, the area that the channel needs to establish its least erosive path down the valley through its normal processes to establish and maintain that, and an area for a stable bank once it's already done that. And so by providing that, you're ending up with a situation where if a new house comes in and builds right up to the edge, it still has room for the river to be at its least erosive, least incising and dangerous position, and a stable bank. And hopefully everybody stays happy and healthy, and the river doesn't decide to do something more remarkable, which can still happen. So it also is avoiding the vicious cycle. So that's to say that when we have high floods, we have damage, and people have losses and injury, and there's pain, and people need to have help. And a lot of that is to prevent property damage in the future. And there's this instinct to dig out the channel and to fill on the banks and to berm up along the edges and armor the banks and all these steps that people want to take. And some of these you can do and some of these you can't, but they're trying to do a spot fix on this place that's so important to the business or to the home. But when you end up doing that, you're really degrading the function of the stream and the river. You're degrading the ability of the floodplain to function, to slow the water down, and you're deflecting the energy and the water, the debris onto somebody else. Sometimes it's the culvert for the town and the road. Sometimes it's your neighbor across the stream. And so this is a process that drives really bad outcomes. So it's a positive feedback system with negative outcomes or a vicious cycle. And what we're trying to do is escape from that by not putting stuff in harm's way. So a protected river corridor allows the river to move over time and maintain that lowest gradient, least erosive path in the valley, and nobody freaks out and everybody thrives. So the river corridor includes the 50-foot setback also from very small streams. So in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the extent of the mapped river corridor, and then here's this little piece sticking off in the middle of the map. And this is an area which is just, it's not actually, the lateral extent is not mapped, but for small streams with at least a half-mile watershed, these are just identified, and then the distance to be protected is determined as a 50-foot setback from the top of the bank in the real world. They're just too hard to really map precisely at this scale. So room for rivers, don't build closer than what's already in the area of the river corridor. So this is one of the other ways it works out in the bylaw. So it says that if you do have a river corridor and something already there are certain ways in which you can allow things to be built which are no worse for the river or stream. So on the left, it talks about a shadow area. So again, here's a river channel flowing from right to left in the landscape, and this orange area is the river corridor. On the left is a model about shadowing. So here's a building, a house, existing already kind of crazy close to the river and in the river corridor. But if you were going to put up a shed or a garage or even another house, you could conceivably do that by putting it further away from the river, no closer, but further away, or just downstream within 50 feet or something very tight, so that, you know, the riprap that you're going to need to protect this building would also really protect something that close. And if you do that, it doesn't mean that this building is magically protected, but it does mean that it's no worse for the river and the river channel than what's already situated in that position. And the same thing in this case for the yellow area. This is an existing septic field. And so if you had to replace the septic field, you could put it further away from the river than the existing one, or just immediately downstream from that. And it would be no worse than the existing situation for the river and its ability to come to an equilibrium flow, least erosive flow in the valley. It's already lost that area. And so to put something behind it is not really a big impact. The other way that plays out is in the village or the hamlet or a developed area. And if you had buildings that exist, here's two buildings and they're pretty close together, it could be so close, like inside of 300 feet, that there's no way that the river can be allowed to meander in between these two things and come back out without both of these structures needing to put up a huge amount of riprap to protect them. So ideally in this situation, if these structures are going to be, protected by enormous boulders at some point, then anything in between them as well as behind them is going to be just as lost to the river as what's already lost. And that doesn't mean that these structures are actually going to get riprap in time or actually be safe. But it does mean that it would be no worse to the river than what's already there. So how can we avoid losses due to flooding? We can do that as a family by making good plans and having emergency kits, practicing our emergency plans, getting insurance, getting additional money because insurance usually doesn't cover all the losses, elevating the structure or moving the structure in the nick of time. And now we have probably 10 or 12,000 structures that are already in a high risk zone. And most of them are not able to do this. Most of them don't have an emergency kit. And none of them, or very few of them, are being elevated or relocated in the nick of time. At the community level, we can adopt regulations, use the best available information, and really try to direct future growth not into harm's way and not aggravate the risk to existing structures and families and assets and roads and schools that are already in the hazard zone, and be taking steps to reduce the existing exposure to friends and family and their buildings that we know about that are at risk. And we could be trying to improve emergency response, get more people on the road crew, more people doing fire department work so that when push comes to shove and we need people, we have people. And of course, all that takes considerable effort at the community level. But to the extent that we're not increasing the level of risk and the amount of work that the fire department and ambulance department and the police will need to be doing, the more likely we'll have a flood with less damage and loss. So at the state level and at the federal level, we're trying to develop data, information about flooding and erosion risks, and provide model regulations and develop incentives for communities to do the right thing to steer out of disaster if they choose. On the right, a map showing dots, locations of where communities have submitted for help from the federal government under public assistance after federally declared disasters. This is really the case it is everywhere across the state. We're all working with each other to help each other during a crisis. And in Vermont, the idea is, how do we do this in a way that's not increasing this all the time, but how do we bend the curve toward reducing the costs and losses for all of us at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, and as private individuals. So that's where the Vermont Emergency Relief and Assistance Fund kicks in, ERAF. And that's an incentive for communities to take action ahead of time. Communities that anywhere in the state that are affected by a federally declared disaster, the federal government, the federal taxpayers, all of us in this virtual room, pick up most of the cost of that loss to the community, 75% of it. And then on top of that, the state picks up at least 7.5% of the total eligible costs as well. And the community picks up the remainder of the costs. And that could still be a fair chunk of change in the budget. It might affect somebody's job or a couple of positions in town or things that the community really wanted to be doing. Communities that have taken the basic steps, the 4 basic steps of being in the National Flood Insurance Program, having a local emergency operations plan or management plan, having a local hazard mitigation plan, having road and bridge standards, like most of the communities in the MARC region. These communities all get a split. So 75% gets picked up by federal taxpayers, the state picks up half of the remainder, and the community picks up the last portion of the remainder of the bill. So $125,000 out of $1 million is still a pretty large chunk of change. And communities that do all those 4 things and protect river corridors as part of a statewide strategy to manage erosion and the loss of culverts and bridges and roads all the time. The state will pick up the larger portion of that remainder, leaving the community with the least budget impact from the federally declared disaster costs. So again, you can learn about that at the community reports page at Flood Ready. Gives you basic data about the region, the counties, the towns, what's going on, what the ERAF rate is, how many buildings are estimated to be in the high-risk area, when the municipal plan was adopted and expired. And in our work at the planning level, at the education level, engagement with the community, thinking about our communities is really important. And we all know that it's hard to get people to come out to a planning commission meeting or a select board meeting without, an authorized electric rock and roll band. So we really need to find ways of broadening the conversation, doing the public education, engagement, thinking together, and caring about the risks that we're all engaged in. A lot of times, as you know, the NIMBYs come out whenever something's proposed on a plan or bylaw. They don't want their corner to be affected in a way that they find unacceptable or not to their favor. And thinking about things from the new Vermont environmental justice policy framework, we're really trying to figure out who isn't at the table, who is most at risk here, and how do we make sure we're hearing from people? What do we need to do to make sure people can learn and incorporate this and be part of the process? Does it take food on the table? Does it take childcare at the meeting? Does it take showing up in the middle of the day instead of in the middle of the night on an icy, snowy night? How do we have meaningful engagement, and how do we make sure that we're moving in a way that people can understand and be involved in? And in Windsor County, in the Mount Scottney region, we have the time to bear down on that and figure out how we can plan not to have a disaster, and how not to have the people that didn't show up get washed away. So again, river corridor protection and thinking about special flood hazard areas in terms of no adverse impact on the system, and hence no adverse impact on our neighbors, and minimizing the damage that's going to happen to our culverts, bridges, roads, and public services and budgets. So from here, updating plans or hazard mitigation plans, perhaps as necessary. Coordinating, again, it's really important as planning commissions get into this work and start doing some self-education to ask people from the regional commission to come and talk, or ask John Broker Campbell to come talk, or sometimes I can even show up if I can show up online. But to be involved in learning, and especially getting the select board and the planning commission to learn together with the community so that everybody can get the same signals and work together on a timeline to make this successful for the community. Ultimately, when you have a draft, send it to me, send it to Vermont DEC or John, and we would run a checklist to be sure that it has all the tiny little picayune nuts and bolts for the National Flood Insurance Program in place, so it doesn't go astray at the last possible minute. We can also make sure that if you're doing river corridor protection, the community qualifies for the highest benefit under ERAF. And we want to do all that with the draft, and we want to do that with the finished adopted bylaw before FEMA's deadline shows up. So really by this prep deadline and before the letter of final determination, if we can do that. So map update page, and again, I'll put that link into the chat after this so you can follow up and keep up with the county-wide deadlines as they come along. So a lot of different resources available: floodready.vt.gov, floodtraining.vt.gov, the Flood Atlas, which has the digital flood insurance rate maps, the model regulations are available online. There's a whole bunch of handouts. So again, one of those I'll be putting into the chat in a moment. And there's a lot of help available from the staff at the Mount Scottney Regional Commission, John Broker Campbell, myself, and each other. So we got to stay in touch with each other and thank you very much for the time to talk with you tonight. And I'd be happy to take any questions that have popped up during the presentation. Thank you.
Ned, there's a question in the chat from Chuck. I don't know. Do you see that?
Yeah,
Let's
can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Please, yeah.
Can you
Go
hear
ahead.
me?
Yeah.
All right, great. So thank you so much. This was very exciting, very informative. You know, I've had an understanding that some of the data that goes into the mapping updates, you know, is old data, new data, and a combination of it.
Yeah.
How much do you know about the Black River, and could you go into a little detail on that? Because, you know, some of the data does look odd when you look at that watershed. So I am glad that it's being updated.
Yeah. So yeah, the Black River has been identified and prioritized for a new detailed study, and so that's the exciting thing.
Did it get that because of the aberrations? Why was it prioritized?
Well, again, the official answer to that, Chuck, would be that the community said that it needed to be done. So I don't know whether you were involved in that, but somebody probably said, "Hey, Black River, you know, we got a lot of stuff going on here. We need the information updated." And they looked at it and they said, "Well, there's a lot of people along the Black River, and there's a lot of development pressure, and it sure would be good to get ahead of this and make sure people have the best available information." So that's what they chose to do. Yeah. So what that'll mean is that they will take a new reading of the flood discharges for the Black River. There are a few, John, correct me. I don't think there are any flood gauges directly on the Black River. So I think what they do typically is they'll say, okay, so the Black River is at this latitude, this elevation, has this size, it has this kind of gradient, and these other systems, the Sugar River and the Ashuelit and the Ottaquiche and so forth, they'll look at comparable rivers in the region, and they'll use those to come up with a regional approximation of what the 1% annual chance discharge is for the Black River. And they'll use that by which to delineate the discharge, you know, essentially from the mouth on up. And so as they go up, they kind of parse it out from the different branches that feed into the Black River to, you know, based on the size of those watersheds, again, the elevation, the amount of area in wetland and water, all those features. So that's basically the process that they'll do. And then as an outcome, they'll be also looking at the bridges, you know, like here in Montpelier, we had a remarkable event you may have heard of in July. And what's happened in that case is that in both Barrie and Montpelier, the water flows happily on down the river in flood stage, and then it slams into a railroad bridge. And the railroad bridges are all placed at elevations which are convenient to railroads in the 1800s. And so that actually turns out to be in the water. And so they collect trees and sheds, propane tanks, and pieces of styrofoam and become instant dams. And so, you know, to some degree, when they do the modeling, they're going to model the fact that part of the bridge is hanging in the water and blocking up the water. They don't show that the water is no longer flowing over the bridge because the bridge has become a dam, but they do show that there's some blockage going on here, and they add those kinds of details into the map that they develop.
Ned, there is
so in our case, it's definitely going to handle the flood control piece, because that really changes the way the Black operates compared to Saxton's, compared to the Williams and the Ottaquiche. The flood control is a huge component.
Yeah, that's always taken into account. Yeah.
Okay.
That's all. Yeah. So that's yeah. In the case of you know, Montpelier, going back to where I live, famously the Wrightsville Reservoir, you know, got pretty high, and but by the time it fills up and starts spilling over the emergency spillway, it's beyond the stage of the 100-year flood or the 0.1% chance flood for the North Branch. So at that point, all bets are off. All sorts of other water is coming, but it's not modeled in the maps. It's not legally required to model in the maps.
Chuck, my sense from having been a part of the Deerfield process is that Springfield's most significant changes will likely come in those smaller streams with the new 2D modeling, like Carly Brook, and is it Great Brook that comes in North Springfield there?
Yes,
that's where my gut tells me that's where Springfield's going to see more changes than along the main stem of the Black from the North Springfield Dam to the confluence of the Connecticut.
Okay, thank you.
I just put the fact sheet for information for the Mount Scottney region into the chat, so you can grab that. It has a whole bunch of links that you can use to go on to look at the existing maps and catch up on the flood map update page as well. And keep the questions coming. I've got a couple other links I'm going to try to throw in here.
Jason, I don't know if you can speak to it. I don't know what towns in the region are like actively looking at zoning and or floodplain regulations. You know, a couple have somewhat recently adopted new regs, but this may warrant another look at those.
Well, Win and Deb are here. West Windsor's looking into them. I think you guys might have a draft for review perhaps, but so they're definitely looking at that. Weathersfield had an old model an older A&R model that they were looking at, and I'm frankly not sure where that is at this point. They might be looking at that. That's all I can think of. Anyone else on the call aware of something else? We keep talking about it in Springfield, but we haven't gotten there.
Yeah.
In terms of the river corridor stuff.
Yeah, I think in Springfield, yeah, that's going to be our next step. We're going to try to put the town plan to bed and clear that, but that flood work would be the next upcoming project.
Right. And I confess, as a Weathersfield resident, I feel somewhat in the dark that I didn't know we were talking about them. So I'm ashamed to admit that.
Well, it was 5 years ago, John, but it's still out there. I don't know the status, like I said.
There's some questions in the chat. I don't know if you can.
I just, Chuck, I saw your question. I'm throwing in a link right now. I have to rummage. Maybe John knows better, but you were asking about berms, and berms are illegal in Vermont. So they are, we don't want to do berms because berms, piles of stuff along the river, deflect the water back at your neighbor, at the roads, and they narrow the ability of the floodplain to function, which, you know, again, to protect the building, you can sandbag a building, you can do stuff to protect the building, but you can't berm up and restrict the floodplain because that really is increasing the risk to your neighbor. It's hostile. And so those are not allowed under the state stream alteration permit. It's also an issue for local floodplain management, as John can point out as well.
Yeah,
but there is a permit required, and maybe as John talks, I'll fish around and see if I can see if there's a way to actually see where the permits have been issued.
Yeah, and Mark, I can answer that question specifically for the town of Reading. No berms under the Reading flood regulations would be allowable because Reading not only has floodplains, they also have river corridors, and they have a very strict no fill component within your regulations. So anything that is constructed in Reading, and I suspect I know many of the berms you are referencing in your question, those all represent violations of the currently adopted Reading regulations.
So how do we go about, exploring that? There have been some berms that have been constructed that have since been taken down. Now they've been modified, and I've been notified of another berm that has been built out of public site in the middle of the North Branch of the Black River by a very large property owner.
Yeah, if you know of those, and I've been in contact with your floodplain administrator specifically on this, so but the best way to do it is to address them as they come up and hopefully get ahead of it before folks become really tethered to their berms. And Ned, I don't know if there's a public facing database for like the next flood measure permits that get issued.
I think I just put in the best I could find, the database for the stream alt permits. And I think that's where they do appear. Yeah.
Perfect.
Um,
And I will say for some berms, some are permitted under the stream alteration rules as like a next flood measure, and that's up to the engineer to determine. But many of them that get constructed specifically post flood are truly just violations that need to be either permitted or remedied by the local municipality.
I also, back in there a couple of chats ago, I stuck in the listserv for flood resilience listserv. So if anybody's interested, it is a listserv for anybody involved in community flood management, and we share resources and trainings and ideas and deadlines and grants, and it's a good place just to stay in touch. So you may be on the zoning administrators listserv or not, or the VPA listserv or not, but this is really focused around flood resilience for municipal officials and planners, people that are working on those issues anywhere in the state. So you can click on that and add your email, and you'll get a mailing or 2 or 3 a week, probably something like that. I think that might be end of questions. I don't know, Jason, what do you think?
Well, last chance, folks. We're back to wrap this up. If you have any questions, let us know.
I have a statement. Thank you so much. This was extremely informative, much appreciated, and I learned a lot in a quick amount of time.
Thank you so much. That's good to hear.
Thanks, Chuck. I'm just going to throw out. I live locally. I live in the Montesquieu region. So as you get into the mapping process, as those draft map comes out, as you start talking about bylaw updates, and whether you want to talk about increased, flood hazard standards or incorporating river corridors, please let me know. I'm happy to come to you, to your town, to your planning commission, select board meeting, whatever it might be. Happy to do so. I know Wynn, I think, has jumped off, but I've been to West Windsor a handful of times over the years, having a similar conversation. So please feel free to reach out.
Thank you.
And so I do see a question in the chat. So yeah, we are going to make the recording available, the fact sheet, the website links. So we can send that around to you all, and basically feel free to reach out to me, Ned, or John, with further questions. Anything else before we wrap it up? Gone.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the time to talk with everybody. Take care.
Thanks, Ned. I really appreciate it. Thanks, John.
Bye.
Thank you.